Karen Fruge to the defense.
Greetings, professor, class, jurors. 1 in 4 women in the U.S. experience domestic violence during their lifetime. We're here to speak about a woman who suffered at the hands of her husband. And being the woman she is, she remained quiet and bared these beatings in silence for the sake of her marriage. The prosecution failed to bring light to the true circumstances. She was a vulnerable human being that was the victim of such domestic violence at the hands of her husband, who was a man of 6 feet 2 inches tall, 210 pounds, and Mrs. Jones is 5'4", 120 pounds. Mr. and Mrs. Jones were married for 8 years. In this time frame, Marsha's husband caused her mental trauma from the beatings he subjected her to at his hands. The man she loved and adored. These beatings led her to suffer from battered woman syndrome, and eventually, Mrs. Jones did what she felt was necessary to get the beatings to stop. Hence, she should be acquitted of all charges. Marsha Jones was married to Elma Jones at the age of 22. Her husband was a habitual drinker and had been mistreating Marsha, often beating her while he was drunk over the course of 8 years. Ms. Jones was suffering from all these beatings and depression, all for the sake of her marriage. And due to these beatings for a long period of time and the domestic violence, my client began to suffer from battered woman syndrome. Now, for those of you that don't know, BWS is what we'll call it, is a condition that develops when a person experiences abuse at the hands of their intimate partner. They experience repeated physical abuse, emotional abuse, thoughts which contribute to an increasing inability to leave the batterer, no matter how tough, no matter how harsh the beatings are. 6 months ago, my client, Marsha Jones, was at home waiting for the return of her husband. When Mr. Jones arrived home at 11 p.m., he returned in a drunken state, as usual, and he started a fight with his wife. He started to punch her in the stomach, and upon seeing that he would not stop, she ran to the living room and retrieved her husband's revolver. Now, again, let's think of the extreme mental state she must have felt in that moment, and she did what she felt was right. And unable to take those beatings anymore, boom! Pow! She pulled the trigger. Not once, but twice. Then her husband fell. So she immediately went to call 911 and explained everything. Now, my client, Mrs. Jones, she didn't try to hide the incident because she did what she felt was necessary in that moment to protect her dignity and her life. The autopsy report of her husband disclosed that Mr. Jones had blood contained alcohol in an excessive amount. So as we know in other cases, it has been argued that victims of BWS, again, that's battered woman syndrome, who kill in the midst of their partner's violence, even while the partner is asleep, believe they were in immediate danger. My client being of small stature and her husband being a big man, let's say, felt that she was in imminent danger in that moment. In the Supreme Court case of the People versus Torres, the judge stated it is the defendant's state of mind and sense of fear that are critical to a justification defense. In this regard, proof of violent acts previously committed by the victim against the defendant, as well as any evidence that the defendant was aware of specific prior events or violent acts, is admissible as bearing upon the reasonableness of the defendant's apprehension of danger at that time of the encounter. As we know, Mrs. Jones felt danger in that moment, in that encounter with her husband. Hence, my client has successfully established her case as per law, and she should be acquitted. Further, prosecution miserably failed to prove that her husband did not abuse her for the last 8 years. My client, Marsha Jones, is a battered woman who suffered a long period of domestic violence at the hands of her husband. Mrs. Jones is not a habitual offender, and she has no history of a criminal record. Rather, she is a victim of domestic violence and battered woman syndrome. She was a wonderful wife who did everything to save her marriage. So I pray that the jury consider all the circumstances against my client and acquit her of all charges. Thank you.